Welcome. This is the Global Summit House podcast. Catch power interviews and discussions with influential, inspiring, and powerful people. Explore what's possible by tuning into this podcast with our all-new The Writers Project episodes, featuring one of the world's most inspired thinkers and writers. Visit our website at www.globalsummithouse.com.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the show. I am Brenda, and I am your host for today. Today, I will be interviewing Deborah Doppelt, who is the author of A Mother's Journey, a story of drugs, suicide, and survival. Deborah, take a minute to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you and your work.
Okay, thank you so much. My name is Deborah Doppelt. I am a retired health and physical education teacher. I've taught for many, many years, and I am now working as a permanent sub in a local high school in all areas of education. As such, I've always believed in a healthy body and mind. I've never smoked. I never did drugs. My mother was a heavy smoker, and I could never stand the smell. Our house always smelled. The cars always smelled. Joshua was born on the correct time, the correct weight, the correct length for a baby boy. However, he turned blue when he was first born, and he was placed in the NICU at the hospital. He remained there for a week and came home on a monitor in case of SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. Every time he moved at night, the alarm would go off, and my husband and I would run into his room, and there were always false alarms. He was taken off the monitor after about 6 months and put on medication. He continued to develop normally, hitting all the milestones at, kids his age. He did well in elementary school and junior high school. It was at this time period that we had a chance to move to a different town. And I believe this was difficult for Josh, because he was going from a small school to a larger regional one where he didn't know anyone. And unfortunately, he made friends with the wrong, group of children. He began smoking pot in high school, as many kids did, at the time. And I believe this was the beginning of his, gateway into more serious drug problems. He enrolled in college an hour away, and this really began his journey downhill. I would call him when he was supposed to be in class, and he would be asleep. And he was also not asked to re-enroll. He tried to kick the habit of the beast that was hold of him. He went to weekend programs, a couple of months in Connecticut, and finally 5 years in Boca House in Florida. He worked a program as directed. He worked off-site. They were given jobs off-site. He even rolled back into college, and we were really thrilled. He was in a junior college. He then got into FAU as a junior. And my husband and I at the time, we were thrilled that he was finally on the road to recovery. However, this was not to last. My son Josh committed suicide January 3rd, 2008, from an overdose of Oxycontin, which he had taken also with an overdose of alcohol and Xanax. He had been diagnosed with ADHD, as many children are today, at the age of 12. Unfortunately, Josh would not take his medication as directed, and they were often changed. Because he also lied to the doctors. He wouldn't take them as directed, he would change them. And this was one huge regret that I still have to this day, that I agreed with my husband at the time to put him on medication. But as they say, hindsight is 20/20. The hardest part, that while he was away, birthdays and holidays had to be celebrated without him for the first few years. And this was extremely sad times for us. My holiday was always Thanksgiving, after my mother couldn't do it anymore. And those holidays were so, so difficult without him. Eventually, after he was okay for a few years, he was eventually allowed to come home for a weekend or a holiday, which was just wonderful for us.
And so, Deborah,
but on that New Year's Eve of 2000, I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead. When you said he was away, is that when he was away at college or at the treatment center?
No, I'm sorry. That was at Boca House, at the treatment house. Yeah, he was allowed to come home for a couple of holidays. But on that New Year's Eve of 2007, he called from Florida to wish us a Happy New Year. And that's when he was doing so well in college. And during the conversation, he told us that he had broken up with his girlfriend, wonderful girlfriend that he had been dating for 5 years, and he wasn't doing well in college. So we said, come home. You're only 23, start over. You can go back to school here. And he said no, he liked the weather there, and he gave us all these other excuses. But it left us, very, very upset. And we didn't like the way he sounded. And 3 days later, on January 3rd, 2008, I received a call from my dog walker, because I was still teaching at the time, that the police were looking for my husband. And I had my cell phone with me, which I always left in my office, but for some reason I carried it with me. I just had a funny feeling that day. Call it mother's intuition. I knew something was terribly wrong. I kept calling the police station over and over again, and they just said that the police chief and my husband at the time were on their way to my school. It was about 20 minutes later, the patrol car pulled up, and I saw my husband crying, and I just knew something was wrong with Josh. And he got out of the car, and he said Josh was gone, that he had overdosed the night before. So, of course, I was hysterical crying, and I told my principal that, I had to leave, and of course she understood. And I had to go home now and make funeral arrangements for my son. Parents are not supposed to bury their children. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Deborah, I'm so sorry that you went through that with.
I know. It was heartbreaking. It was just absolutely heartbreaking.
Now,
a disease is one thing, but a suicide is. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Go ahead and finish.
What were we going to say? Okay. A disease is one thing, but suicide is totally different. It leaves a devastating mark on the entire family. The funeral was the worst day of our lives. I vividly remember walking up to the casket, hysterical crying, and I kissed his cheek. The gravesite was just awful. Grave diggers looking on, just another day for them, but heartbreaking for us. I'm now divorced. We had to sell our home. My daughter was on a swim trip with her team to Puerto Rico and had to come right home. My parents were totally devastated. One famous TV personality said, and I quote, "Suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem." I just think that's the best quote of all. When I do these talks in schools, I tell the classes, there are no do-overs in life. You only get one body and one brain. Please take care of it. Teenagers think it'll never happen to them. When you go to a party and somebody offers you a drug, just say no. I know that sounds like a simple cliche, but it is the truth. One bad drug can be a killer. If it comes from a friend, find a new friend. I also quoted in my book this famous neurologist, Dr. Jay Geed. He's from the National Institute of Mental Health, and he states, the frontal lobe is the CEO of the brain. It's not that teens are stupid or incapable of things. It's unfair to expect them to behave as adults before these brains are finished being built. This is the time when the brain is most vulnerable and when they are more likely to experiment with drugs or alcohol. He goes on to say, we used to think that the brain was adult sized by age 6, and they were largely set in place. We now know that this is not true. Even through childhood and teen years, there is enormous capacity for change, and this is very empowering empowering for teens. And then whenever I used to have to attend a party or meet people for the first time, the situation always becomes very strange for me. They would always ask, how do you know the host? How many children do you have? And that's when I became very nervous. Do I say one or two, but one passed away? And then how do I explain if the conversation usually ends up, one passed away, how do I explain? And then I usually walk away. After all was said and done, I ended up going to a wonderful bereavement therapist for a few years after Josh passed away. This was extremely helpful for me as she explained that Josh had a mental disease. You can't always see that in someone, but is always there for sure, whether a chemical imbalance, maybe from when he turned blue as a baby, or borderline personality disorder, as finally diagnosed by his doctor in Florida. I feel Josh is in a safe place now. His demons are no longer. The hole in my heart is still there and will be there forever. Our family has moved on. My daughter is wonderful. She's a very successful attorney who's presently engaged to a wonderful guy. My parents have both passed away. My ex-husband and I are now friends. But also in 2007, the year that he was in Boca House in Florida, I don't know if you saw it on 60 Minutes, but there was a famous doctor who went to jail for prescribing the opioid epidemic. And it was also on the news. And Josh also said while he was in Boca House that he could go 2 blocks away and get whatever drugs he wanted. So that's the end of the story. I don't know if you have any questions, Brenda, for me, and also, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask.
Deborah, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. I can't imagine how difficult as a mom it is, one, to go through all that you've been through and try to hold the family together afterwards, and then to be here publicly sharing what has gone on for you. I guess my first question would be what inspired you? At what point did you know that you wanted to write about your story and Joshua's story?
Yeah, it's funny. A parent at my school, I never had a diary as a child, and a parent at my school gave me a journal. And my bereavement therapist was wonderful. She said, you know what, you have to get these thoughts out of your head. So at school, I had a computer, and she said, you have to get these thoughts out of your head. So after school, I would stay for an hour or two, and I would start writing down a sentence or two, and then it would become a paragraph or two. And then I also had a friend who, my gynecologist put me in touch with a woman who had a writing workshop, one of his patients actually. One thing led to another, and I went to one of her workshops, and it turned into a book. So one sentence went to a paragraph, and then it became a book. It's only 90 pages, but I want it as a guide to kids that might be led to a drug program, and if I can just help them in some way. But I have to tell you, Brenda, 6 months after Josh died, I didn't put this in this story that I just told you. 6 months after Josh died, I had shoulder surgery, and I couldn't write because my arm was in a sling. And I started writing a list for my husband at the time, and it came out, my words didn't come out correctly. And my sister-in-law was a nurse at the time, and she said, I don't like the way she sounds. Take her to the hospital for an MRI. They found a grapefruit-sized mass on my brain. It turned out to be a meningioma. Yeah, it turned out to be a meningioma. So I ended up 4 days later in the hospital with a 6-hour surgery, taking this brain tumor out of my head. This was 6 months after Josh died. So this is right after Josh passed away. And I've always seen the glasses full. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. What could I do? Hide under the covers and make things go away? That's not me.
Right.
So I always have put one foot in front of the other. I face things head on, and I'm laying in the hospital. My head is in a bandage. My arm is in a sling. The summer of 2008 was a nightmare. But what could I do? I had to keep going forward. That's just me. I've always been that kind of person. So that's what my daughter is, the love of my life. And this is what keeps me going.
It sounds
this is why I try to help other people. That's my.
It sounds like
I don't know how I made it through that summer, but I did.
Well, you're a very strong, brave woman.
Yeah, I've always been strong, and if I could help somebody else, that's my goal. So.
I so love your heart.
My book is only about 80 pages. So yeah, I'm a tough cookie. It takes a lot to bring me down. So it is what it is. And like I said, if I could help another kid out there, that's my goal. I do this other talk at my a school up in North Jersey, and I've got letters from kids that if I could turn one kid around, that's my goal. And that's it in a nutshell. There's nothing else I can add. That's my story. I'm sticking to it.
Well, Deborah, it sounds like
it's helpful for me, Brenda. It really is. It's like I said, if I can help one kid out there, that's all that matters. It's all that matters to me.
I hear that.
I've never done drugs. I've never even smoked pot. What I've gone, like I said, you only get one body and mind. Take care of it. Don't take any stupid chances. Like if you get a disease, you can't help it. That's a different story. But if you can avoid these things, do it. Like I said, especially with this pandemic now, people are dying, and it's not their fault.
Deborah, thank you so much.
Well, take a chance if you can avoid it. So
you have such.
Anyway, thank you for having me.
You have such a wise, you're so wise. You've been able to turn this tragedy into a teaching moment for other children, and I'm sure other parents as well. So I just one more question for you before we close out.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, sure.
For somebody who's looking for your book, wants more information on how to contact you, how to have you maybe speak at their school, how do people get in touch with you, Deborah?
Yes, absolutely. Give them my email.
Okay, could you go ahead and repeat that out loud for us?
Sure. You have my website, or I could give you, it's debdopp@gmail.com. Deb, D-E-B, D-O-P-P @gmail.com.
Perfect. So that's debdopp@gmail.com. And Deborah, where does somebody buy your book? The book, the name is A Mother's Journey, a story of drugs, suicide, and survival.
Amazon. Amazon.com.
Amazon.com.
Yeah, it's on Amazon.
Awesome. All right, everybody. For those of you.
And it's Dopp with 2 P's.
Dopp with 2 P's. So Deb Dopp, DEBDOPP @gmail.com.
Yes. And I would love to do more talk. Seriously. It really helps me.
Absolutely. And so audience out there, those of you listening to our show, thank you for joining us. Deborah, thank you for joining us. Those of you who know
thank
somebody.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Those of you who know somebody who has committed suicide, has thoughts of suicide, or even teens, as Deborah has talked about, that should hear this message, please, by all means, like and forward this on so that they can get this information from Deborah and can get their hands on her book, A Mother's Journey, a story of drugs, suicide, and survival. Thank you again, everyone, for being on our show.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Global Summit House podcast. Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Podbean, iHeartRadio, iTunes, or Google Play. Connect with us at globalsummithouse.com. See you on the next episode.